Hi, I'm Dr. Gina Sully, and I'm here to talk to you about analyzing Jamaica Kincaid's Girl. I'm going to introduce to you a tool that you probably already know, the journalist questions, in order to analyze both the rhetorical situation and to analyze a literary text. But first, a little warning. These two little, Peter and Griffin here, yeah, these two little guys, they're ticked. They're annoyed with me because I haven't paid enough attention to them today. And tonight I have ignored them completely instead of sitting on this very couch between the two of them with their heads on my knees. So if you hear noise in the background, it is my dogs being displeased. All right. So the journalist questions, you might know them as the 5 W's and an H. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Okay. When you're analyzing the rhetorical situation, that's what you're analyzing. The questions that you generate using these terms will lead you to the elements of the rhetorical situation. Okay, so who reads the text? The audience. What kind of text is it? Well, that's the genre. When and where was this text produced or published? That's context. Why is the text structured and written as it is? That leads us to the author's purpose. And how is the text structured? Leads us to form. It's a little different here. Let me see if I can move this little thing here because I don't want this here. We're going to just put it up there out of the way for a minute. I don't know if it records that, but if it does, it's out of the way, and this is the journalist questions. Okay. When we're analyzing a text, we ask different questions, of course. We don't ask who reads it, or who wrote it. We ask who speaks or acts in the text. What will readers expect to see in the text of this genre? When and where does the action take place in the text? Just add in the text to everything. All right. Who speaks or acts? Well, that's characters. In poetry, the person who speaks is called a speaker. In fiction, it's generally called a narrator, the person who's telling the story, not the people who are actually dialoguing in the story. What will readers expect to see in a text of this genre? What are the conventions of the genre? That's really the question. What is the question of the genre? So you're going to do the rhetorical analysis first so you can identify the conventions of the genre, right? You need to know what the genre is before you can identify the conventions of it. Okay. When and where does the action take place in the text? That's the setting. Why did the author choose the devices they did, and why do those devices affect readers as they do? This is about form. Well, that helps you identify theme, message, emotional effects on readers, all of which help the author achieve their purpose. Okay. How is the text structured? Well, what we want to know when we're analyzing the text is how does that form? How do the elements used to structure the text, how do they help deliver the message, theme, or emotional effect? And that's where we look at the literary devices, things like dialogue, uh, use of metaphor, rhyming, uh, use of verses, uh, sentences. What else? Literary devices. I mean, I'm drawing a complete blank right now, but there's a billion of them. Diction, word choice, tone, uh, 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 the typography, the font. The font matters. Font matters most in poetry, but it matters. Fonts indicate things. Changes in font indicate change in something. Okay, so who speaks or acts? What will readers expect to see in this genre? When and where does the action take place? Why did the author choose these devices? And does the use of the devices, the form, so form and purpose inextricably linked. You can't, I mean, you can talk about them separately, but eventually you have to bring them back together. All right. All righty. Well, I just love moving this stuff around. All right. When and where was the text produced and published? This is rhetorical situation stuff. Now, in 1978 in New York, this was published in June in the New Yorker magazine. In 1978, the Equal Rights Amendment was on the topic of discussion everywhere in the United States. The Equal Rights Amendment has 3 articles. The first article says that no government entity in the United States, not state entity, not the federal, that discrimination against people, unequal treatment of people based on sex or gender would be prohibited. And it says it's sort of like this. The federal government, neither the federal government nor the states may enact any laws or legislation that discriminates against people on the basis of sex or gender. The second article says that if states do this, Congress has the power to enact laws to stop them. And then the third provision is that the act would become law, take effect 2 years after it's ratified. So in 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment had passed both in the House and the Senate overwhelmingly by both parties. Both parties, Democrats and Republicans, both endorsed it and all voted for it. I think only 3, might have been 8, but either 3 or 8 Republicans in Congress, altogether, House and Senate, only 3 of them voted against it. And in July of 1978, there was the largest march in history for women's rights in the United States. Over 100,000 people descended upon Washington, D.C., and demonstrated in support of the ratification of the ERA. By 1977, 35 of the 38 states necessary to ratify it had ratified it. But they faced fierce opposition by anti-feminists led by Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly was a conservative politician. She worked for Joe McCarthy during the communist witch hunts of the 40s. I think she went to work for him in the 50s. And she ran for office. But where she really succeeded was she and her organization changed the Republican Party's stance on the status of women dramatically. Between the 1940s and 1980, the ERA and women's rights were part of every Republican platform at the federal level. They endorsed it. They supported it. In 1980, however, Ronald Reagan dropped the ERA from his platform. And the Republicans have increasingly moved away from equality for women in their platforms. And then finally, what we have down here is a link. This link will take you to information like this about every single year between 1953 and 1930, between 1953 and 1993 in US feminism. And it covers things like events, lifestyles, education, economics, religion, politics, law. What else? I've got this in my way again. Legal and the backlash. Oh, and in media too. And the backlash against feminists. So there's some stuff about Phyllis Schlafly in there too. All right, so this is the context, the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, the big conversation about the Equal Rights Amendment at this time centered around housewifery, homemaking. The anti-feminists, led by Phyllis Schlafly, insisted on being called housewives They did not want to use the so-called feminist term homemaker. And they believed that that was women's proper sphere and that we exerted plenty of power within it since we raised the people and stood behind and were married to the people who were doing the leading. And that we should, just kind of stay at home and be homemakers. And they used a lot of the same kind of rhetoric that we're hearing. Well, we're hearing similar rhetoric. It's not exactly the same around gender and identity now. So, for example, one of the ways that Stop ERA got people worked up was to insist, in spite of the face of all, in spite of all of the evidence, that the passage of the ERA meant the elimination of sex or gender segregated bathrooms in public spaces, and that would make public bathrooms, unsafe for women. Sound a little familiar? They also insisted that this would mean that boys and girls would no longer be allowed in federally funded schools to compete in gender segregated sports, that girls would be forced to compete with boys on the same teams, and thus girls would lose out there too. These are all things that we're hearing again today regarding trans people, especially trans women. So I think all of that's really important, but I'm always astonished at how few people younger than me have even heard of Phyllis Schlafly, despite the enormous effect she had on changing the face of the Republican Party. Really kind of, wow. We don't like that. All right. So now we're moving to setting. When and where does the action take place? Well, ChatGPT, Spark Notes, Wikipedia, everybody says it takes place in Antigua, but none of them offer any textual evidence. What they do is rely on the author's home culture or original culture, because by the time she had written this, she had lived in the United States for some time. She was sent here at 16 by her mother to earn money and go home, to send home. She was taken out of school and, sent here. So at any rate, we don't refer to the author when we're doing textual analysis. We don't talk about the author's biography unless we can back it up with textual evidence. So can we? Yes, we can. Where is unstated, but she mentions singing Bena. And Bena is a musical form indigenous to Antigua. So if she's singing Bena, she's probably Antiguan. This idea is strengthened by the words used for these foods. This is only spelled this way in Antigua, and this is the Antiguan word for taro root. So, which is a staple food in the Caribbean. And then finally, we get to Sunday school. So we know it's a Christian setting, but there seems to be a little tension between Bena and the Christians. So at any rate, we find that it was in Antigua. And now I do go for a Google search because I want to look up Antigua and find out how they got Sunday school there. Because Christianity was introduced to the Caribbean. It didn't evolve there. So it was introduced to the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. Okay, so it was a British colony until 1981. The British were the colonizers. And then when is also unstated. But here's really interesting thing about literature. Excuse me while I adjust. If you leave the when or the where or both unstated, well, then we're not, the message of the text then is not being limited geographically or temporally, right? It could be that what you're reading could be universalized, looked at as the experience of all people like the characters. That's not a far leap. Um, okay. Move forward, moving forward, moving forward. So, audience, who's the author writing for? Well, we know that the author is writing for readers of the New Yorker because that's where it was first published, right? And we know that it's the readers would be people who are interested in the or invested in the debates about women's role and the relationship between being a housewife and having power, uh, the ideas about feminism that the second wave feminists had reintroduced into public discourse. The New Yorker frequently published information about and referring to the feminism in the US because people actually talked about feminism in the late 70s. We were actually talking about it. And then finally, I'm wondering if Kincaid is writing for feminists, for people who already agree with her, or if she's trying to persuade anti-feminists to change their minds. So again, that might be an interesting place for a story or for a paper, but it's possible that she's writing to either one or both. All right. Characters, speakers, and narrators. Who acts, speaks, and acts? Well, according to ChatGPT and everybody else, the plain font, the normal font, that's a mother. And the italicized font, that's her daughter. This is how most people read this text. But there's a problem with that because there's nothing in the text that indicates this is the relationship between the characters. Not a thing. Now, it might seem obvious to people who've grown up in certain sorts of cultures where mothers are primarily responsible for delivering this kind of information to their daughters. But there are other cultures where that's not the case. Why did that do that? Let's go back there. Thank you. Yes, I didn't need to do that. But there is some textual evidence that can be interpreted as indicating two characters, okay? The first is the change in font. We've got the plain font and the italicized font. They're the only two fonts used. And what we have is the plain font voice utters 625 words of the 650 words in this text. The italicized voice only does the rest. We have dialogue in which the italicized voice and the plain font voice respond to things others have said, the other has said. That indicates that it's a dialogue, not a monologue, as a matter of fact, as most sources attribute the form. And it could be that the whole thing is an internal monologue or memories one character is having, the girl, right? Did you ever have one of those days where you're being told to do 30, 40,000 different things? Well, does it ever go through your head as you're doing those things? Do this, do that, do this, do that, do this, do that. Well, this is what I should have said. And then it comes out. And then the next do this or do that comes into your head. So it could be that. Not necessarily the case, but it's a possibility, and it's one that you could probably back up with textual evidence. The other possibility is that it's an employer speaking to a maid. People used to refer to their maids as girls. That's my girl. My girl will come and pick up my dry cleaning. My girl will make dinner for my boss. And this possibility opens up the text. I said poem here, but I mean text, to both class and post-colonial analyses, right? Because who are the employers? All right. Now we move into rhetorical purpose. And I don't have a lot to say about that right now, except the author's rhetorical purposes will influence their rhetorical choices, their authorial choices. So it's expressed as a verb. For example, to advocate, to illustrate, to evoke, to describe, to persuade. Again, don't know who she's trying to persuade, if she's trying to persuade. I've bolded to advocate here because I think that might be one of the possibilities. Okay. Um, I'm sorry, I lost my place for a second there. I'm really tired. Here's a link to a not exhaustive list at the Purdue Owl of rhetorical purposes. One thing you should remember is that rhetorical purposes should always be expressed as a verb, always expressed as a verb. I know I said that a little already. I want to emphasize that again. It's a verb, and it's always a verb that begins with the word to. Okay, so next, medium form. What was the physical form in which the text was published? Well, most people say it's a short story. But a short story has plot, action, conflict, resolution. We're used to finding those things in short stories. And at the time it was published, the idea of short stories, we were kind of between the 30s when the short story was popular and the 80s when microfiction became popular. So it might be a short story. It might be a prose poem, a poem that uses prose instead of verses, but still uses the same kinds of poetic devices, like repetition, which is in here, same way that Whitman used it, right? So it could be a prose poem. But what I think is we don't need to figure that out, because what we can do is just look at it and say, hey, dude, that's a single sentence. That's the structure. That's the physical form in which it was published. It's a single sentence of independent clauses separated by semicolons. Okay. Yeah. All right. Now, the next thing, how is the text structured? And now we're looking at the, not the rhetorical analysis, now we're analyzing the text. So how's it structured? Well, this is what ChatGPT has to say. And this is about structure, and this is about structure, and this is about structure. But this is not about structure. This is about theme. And this form highlights several key themes. This indicates that this, and this are themes, but they're not. They're structure. Only one of these things is a theme. So you have to be really careful if you're using this stuff, even to gather information, because this could really mislead people who don't. It's like when someone tells you got to know the rules before you can break them without getting in trouble. Well, that's what this is like. You got to know what these things mean before you can use them without getting in trouble. All righty. So we go to the text, and there's textual evidence that of the form. I'm just looking for some textual evidence of the form. One of the things in the form is the single sentence structure. As I said, I'm going to say that the form is a single sentence. Now, I've included all these words because I want to give you a quick lesson in how to use textual evidence and how to construct an argument using textual evidence. So the first sentence, all the way up to the colon, is my idea. The use of semicolons rather than periods between speakers allows one voice to run over the other. And so we have the plain font giving all of these instructions. Don't sing Benna in Sunday school is up here. She doesn't get to, the response doesn't come until here. And the plain font voice goes on as if it didn't even hear it. At the end here, you can tell where the quote ends because of the closing quotation marks, but also the citation of the author. And then my tying things up sentence. This allows the writer to create the silence, convey the silencing and stifling of girls as they learn to be respectable women. This sentence is the sentence that ties it to the message. So we want to have that at the end always. Then we've got the font change. I already talked to you about this, and so there you go. 625 words, 625 out of 650 words come from one speaker. That's the dominant character. Okay. but we don't lose, using the italics allows the author to visually depict two separate voices without having to slow up that whole list with grammatical conventions like commas and periods and quotation marks and new paragraphs for new speakers and all of those things. So that's important. And then next, we have additional textual evidence of things that matter in the text. So we have repetition. We have repetition of a bunch of phrases. This is how you don't do that. And the slut admonitions. There are 3 slut admonitions in the text, and those are the thing that's the most repeated kind of instruction in there. We're going to just look at lexical ambiguity here. What does that mean? It means we don't know what the word means where it's being used. It's got more than one meaning, and we're not sure which one is being used. So, slut has more than one meaning in British English. It used to in American English too, but it doesn't really anymore. The British tend to use the word slag where we would use slut. Slut in British English, it's changing now, but slut in British English meant a sloppy, lazy woman who's a terrible housekeeper and looks like a slob. That was the dominant meaning at one time. So, having been educated by British educators, of course, the author would be aware of that. And I can't believe that her word choice was accidental. She could have said whore. She could have said prostitute. She could have said bad woman. There's a lot of synonyms for slut. So I think that this must be significant. And then they also use juxtaposition, and I spoke to you about this earlier. When you put the native music being silenced on a Sunday in favor of the colonizer's God, that says something about the colonizers silencing the natives. Or at least it can be read that way. Okay. So again, all of these things tie to the purpose. Now, genre, what type of text is it, or what kind of text is it? Well, it's generally classified as either feminist lit or post-colonial lit. And these generic labels influence readers' expectations of and reactions to what they're reading. Readers expect to find specific conventions in texts that are labeled with a generic label. So first of all, let me say, generic here doesn't mean like, it's not like generic peanut butter where there's no brand, or a generic guy where he's just some random guy who's just like an average guy. It's the adjectival form of genre. Okay, it's how you make it genre into an adjective, generic. Okay. Now I want to tell you a little story about generic expectations and how they can really lose you. Confounding them can do 2 things. And by confounding them, I mean violating them, either by including things that readers wouldn't expect to find there, or by leaving out things readers would expect to find there. And you can either lose shock or delight, or you can do all kinds of things to readers by doing this, but you'll be doing it, if you're an author, you're doing it deliberately, knowingly, hopefully. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little personal story here. In the 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, I ran across this author I had never heard of before, and I read everybody. His name is Dean Koontz, and at this point, Dean Koontz is one of the best-selling authors in the United States. Back then, I hadn't heard of him. And the book was marketed in the stores, in the libraries, as a murder mystery. I love me some murder mysteries. I like puzzles. I like trying to figure them out. And the thing about murder mysteries is that one of the conventions is that if you're a careful reader and you've been following along, before the last chapter, by the end of the second last chapter, before the denouement, before they all gather in the library for Poirot or the detective to tell them how they did it, If you're a careful reader, you should already have a pretty good idea. You should have figured it out. One of the rules of that is required for this, of course, is that you don't add any new information at the end when you're revealing the murderer. The clues the detective followed have to be clues that were available to the readers up until that point. Dean Koontz. So here's what Dean Koontz does. In a murder mystery, a book he labeled and marketed as a murder mystery, in the very last chapter, the murderer is revealed. He's also revealed to be an alien from outer space. And the lighthouse in which he lived was revealed to be a spaceship, which had the power to unmoor itself from the earth and take him home to escape prosecution. Dean Koontz has sold millions and millions of books, but he only sold me one because I was so ticked off about that. I'm just like, if they had said sci-fi mystery, sci-fi murder mystery, if they had combined that, I wouldn't have been so angry, although I still would have been a little annoyed. It would probably be better to know he was an alien before you find out he's the murderer. But there you go. But holy cow, audiences can have really strong reactions to missing things. Now, ChatGPT and other, online sources say that it's literary fiction, and it is. They say that it's post-colonial literature, feminist literature. The ChatGPT response here we have, it actually is more about form and content. Oh, excuse me, than it is about genre. So that's not, really helpful. But we do have some textual evidence that it's literary fiction. As far as published in the New Yorker, a magazine that only publishes fiction that is literary, and evidence that it's feminist fiction. Well, for one, and this is outside the text, but you're reading it in feminist literature class. And if feminism means belief in and advocacy of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes, and a feminist is someone who advocates or supports that, then feminist literature aims to advocate for the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. And this text does, right? All right, and then evidence is post-colonial fiction. Oh, and it's also classified as feminist fiction by scholars, librarians, and booksellers. So, and then evidence that it's post-colonial fiction. Well, I explained it a little before. When you juxtapose the native thing with the colonizer's thing, and then you cover up or silence the native thing with the colonizer's thing, well, that's a post-colonial perspective. All right. So I have an interpretation. And that is that, oh my God, am I recording this? Anyway, my interpretation is that I argued that there could be one character. I've made most of these arguments here or introduced them. That there could be one character, two characters, or many characters. For example, say you're walking through town and there's a lot of people in your family, and you're sitting around the family function. You're not walking through town, you're sitting around a family function. You got your grandmother there, a bunch of your aunts, your dad, your uncles, blah, blah, blah. And they're each telling you stuff you should do. Right? Now, this could just be a memory with a lot of voices in her head. And they're not necessarily mother and daughter, the two characters in this. And I argued that, as I argued earlier, they could be a maid and someone who is training her, or someone who employs her. And yeah. The form is unique and confounds generic conventions, right? Short stories are rarely just one sentence. Flash fiction and prose poetry often are, but flash fiction as a named form didn't exist when this was written. In my opinion, if we're going to go with one of these categories, I think it best fits the category of prose poetry. I think but I think it's just, I just analyze it as a single sentence, and I think that that's just fine. All right. Here's the real important stuff. The title, oh, I'll do that next. But the normal font voice gives a list of, you shouldn't do this. It also tells the italicized voice how to get away with stuff, like bullying men, like getting out of sex when you don't want to have it and he does, like how to abort an unwanted fetus. And here's how you do things just because you feel like it. That's kind of powerful. And so to me, I know that this is often read as the plain font voice, the mother's voice running over the daughter's voice and being very harsh, and but I don't see that. I see this is like, okay, maybe other people can hear us now, and I'm going to tell you do this, this, and this, and this, but now I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you. When she says this is how, she's demonstrating something. And I'm going to show you how to bully a man, and I'm going to show you how to get rid of an abortion, a fetus you don't want. This is a powerful example of women helping women, and not just running over them, but showing us how to get along and how to look like we're being respectable and good, but how to do stuff we want to anyway. And this ties to what I have to say about the slut admonitions. She never warns her not to become a slut in this text. She never warns her not to become a slut. She says, I have warned you about not becoming a slut. But she doesn't say, don't become a slut. She doesn't say, don't walk like a slut. She says, try to walk like a lady so that others don't see the slut. Try to prevent yourself from looking like a slut. Do this so you're not recognized as a slut. And again, the double meaning of slut, you know, ties appearance and internal, right? If I don't look like a slut, then I'm not one in some way. Don't really get it, but in this story, okay, so here, the title of the paper that this is all drawn from was Disguising the Slut with a Lady's Walk, because I think that this is really important part of this text that gets really ignored. And if you load into ChatGPT questions about the slut passages in this text, yeah, it doesn't give you much back. It just is about fear of sexuality. Well, yeah, there's some of that control of girls' sexuality stuff going on there, but it's not as strict or as like oppressive an attitude towards girls' sexuality as saying, don't be a slut. Try not to let people see you being a slut is a lot different than don't be a slut. Okay. And I also want to add, finally, that slut's other meaning also allows for this text to be placed into conversation with Schlafly and the Halt ERA people, most of whom who advocated the position that women belong in the home. And that's, in fact, where we do the most good, where we exercise the most power, and where we do the most good for society, not just for our families. So I'm really proud to say that Jamaica Kincaid kind of liked my analysis, and we talked about it for a couple of hours. Yeah, I was really proud of that. And I'm glad I got to present it to her. And I'm really glad I got to present it to you folks too. I'd ask if you have any questions, but you're not actually here. So what I'm going to do now is close this down and go play with my dogs. I hope that y'all got something out of this, and I'll get those links to Dr. Powell. I have lots of them. I have a sheet of links that I can get to Dr. Powell for you. You take care. Talk to you later. Bye.